Hi, John Dixon here from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're talking with Professor John Lennox about atheism and morality. John, do you need God to be good?
In the sense in which you probably mean the question, no, you don't. From where I sit as a Christian, all men and women have equal dignity as moral beings made in the image of God. And so whether they believe in God or not, they can certainly be good. Indeed, I'd go further than that. Sometimes my atheist friends put to shame people who are professing Christians because they have that sense of dignity. So we need to separate two entirely different things. That is the question of, can an atheist be good? Answer yes. From another question, which is related to it, whether atheism gives rational grounds for the justification of morality. That's a very different issue.
Well, let's talk about that then. An atheist might well say, I've got a good enough ground for my ethic. I don't need a God in order to inspire me to be good.
Well, I'd love to know what that ground is, because it's very interesting that even Richard Dawkins admits that it's very difficult to find a path to any kind of absolute morality in particular without invoking religion. Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov said if God does not exist, or if there's no immorality, then everything is permissible. And I think he was driving at this. And it's very interesting. I've had many a Russian intellectual tell me that Dostoevsky was a prophet. He was exactly right. We thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we discovered we couldn't. Solzhenitsyn adds his famous statement that if you ask me to put it briefly, why 60 million of my fellow countrymen perished, the short answer is because we forgot about God. And therefore, I would want to say that atheism gives no grounds for morality. It falls foul, you see, of Hume's old dictum. You can't get an ought from an is. See, let's put it this way. What are the logical possible grounds to found morality if there's no God vertically? Then it must be either raw nature, nature plus society, some kind of mixture. And I find it very interesting at the attempts to ground morality either in genetics or in some kind of evolutionary progress.
Well, can we talk about that? Because that is one that is raised. Where
very much
we've
so.
Evolved as social beings, so social cooperation is built in, and that's the rational basis for atheist ethics.
Yes, that certainly accounts for something. The you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours is a very reasonable thing. But it certainly doesn't account for the kind of altruism that you get that seems to contradict evolution. That is caring for the weak and looking after people that are seriously diseased, abandoned babies and so on, which incidentally, historically, were all things that Christians tended to get involved in before other people did, because they believed that each man and woman was made in the image of God. And the hard atheists, as distinct from the soft atheists who try to get their ethics from evolutionary psychology or something like this, remind us that the human beings are just one of practically uncountable species and are of no more significance. And John Gray, for example, who's the professor of the history of intellectual thought at London, he says, you know, you really need to face this, that we are of no more significance than slime mold. It's very difficult to get any kind of hard morality out of that.
One philosopher I was reading recently said, anyone can tell that happiness is preferable to suffering. So any ethic that tends toward happiness rather than suffering is good. Therefore, there's an intellectual ground.
Well, how do you measure good? Hitler probably felt that his happiness could be built on untold people's suffering. And I think that that is a very good point, but it's not adequate enough. Going back to the kind of utilitarian philosophy you were mentioning before, utilitarianism works quite well when you've got equal centres of power, when you've got groups of roughly equal power. then they have to behave with one another if they feel, for whatever reason, that behaving to one another is a good thing. But if I get enough power that I don't care what you do to me, and you say, well, if you don't behave to me, I'll say you'll what? And that's exactly what Hitler did. And if there's no ultimate accountability, which is something I'd like to throw into this because it's very important, then justice becomes it simply disappears. And what interests me about Dawkins and co, bringing them back into the equation with their new atheism, he's honest enough, at least, to admit that as he looks at the universe, at bottom there's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. He's never withdrawn that. And it seems to me that, by definition, undermines all morality. And just take atheism itself. There is, by definition, no life after death, so there's no final judgment. So the majority of people in this world whose conscience has cried out for justice will never see it, by definition. Now, I know, and that's been particularly exemplified in one of my debates here in Sydney recently, that they say we're interested in justice in this life, not in that life. But that's a false dichotomy. It's a question of both. And I would have thought that Christians have not been slow in the past to be very active for justice in this life. Indeed, Jürgen Habermas, the leading intellectual thinker who calls himself a methodological atheist, says, look, the foundations of European law and liberty and education are all Christian. We've no other options. Everything else, he adds rather charmingly, is postmodern chatter. So Christianity is very interested in justice in this life, in the law courts, in the processes of justice, precisely because it believes there's a guarantor standing behind that in the form of God, who will be the final judge and will judge the world, I believe, in righteousness and truth. Without that, the whole thing falls.
It still sounds like, I can imagine it sounds to some, like you're saying atheists tend toward injustice and evil.
No, I would emphatically say that is not true, because our inbuilt conscience, which I believe comes from God, they believe it comes from somewhere else. But at one level, it doesn't matter where it comes from, it's there. That inbuilt conscience gives them a sense of justice and goodness. What they don't have is the intellectual underpinning for it. And the fact is, when you look at it straight, there is no ultimate justice for the vast majority of people, because death is the end. How can there be?